Hi, my name is Guy Lawrence, and thanks for tuning into my podcast today. If you're enjoying these conversations and you want to check out more of this transformational work, be sure to come back to guylawrence.com.au and join me as we go further down the rabbit hole. Enjoy the show.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Beautiful. Mate, I ask everyone on the show, let's say you're at a small intimate dinner party and you're sitting next to a few strangers right now and they ask you what you did for a living. What would you say?
Wow. Well, my job, I do have a job. I'm a creative director and I work with a small television network. That's how I pay the bills. What my calling is, literally after my near-death experience, I had this awakened sense of being a manifestation of the unconditional love that I experienced on the other side, if you will. But that's a great question. I love those small dinner parties.
Yeah. Do you find when you're in conversation with people you first met that your near-death experience comes up in conversation often? And do you find people curious if it does?
Yes, and it does often. I mean, in the accident that was the cause of the near-death experience, it crushed both my legs. My left leg was amputated above the knee. It broke my back, it ripped out my shoulders. So the reason it comes up is I walk with a limp. I mean, I walk on a prosthetic limb. And so even with strangers, often they'll say, "What happened to your leg, mate?" And it's like, "Oh, I had a horrible automobile accident." "Oh, wow. Sorry to hear that. When was it?" "Oh, it was here." "Were you in the car alone?" "No, the whole family was there. Unfortunately, half the family passed." So it often does, even in casual conversation, go very, very deep, very, very fast about the experience and what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. How do you find that and cope with it? Because I remember when my dad passed, naturally, of old age, and there was a moment where I just, people would talk and ask, and I just didn't know how to handle it and cope with it and speak to people because I felt like I was having to relive the moment all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and I mean, one must realize the accident was over 20 years ago. So in the beginning, I couldn't even speak of it. I would just cry. And of course, with all the injuries I had, I was in the hospital for almost 6 months. There was 18 surgeries, to put me back together, 18 in total. I was in a wheelchair for months after that. I mean, it was over a year, it was a year before I was up and walking on a prosthetic limb. And so, the healing process physically was traumatic, but the grief was worse. And I literally couldn't speak of it. I didn't speak of my near-death experience to anyone really in the beginning, except my close immediate family. And, I was quite reclusive in those years, to be honest. I would go to work. I mean, I was still raising my surviving son. And yeah, I didn't speak much of it because if I did, as you've pointed out, I couldn't even say their names. I would fall apart and begin crying. And, it was very, very, I grieved heavily. Now I can talk about it, but it was almost a decade. It was a decade before I ever wrote a book or ever spoke about it publicly.
Wow. Would you, as we sort of going in that direction, would you mind sort of sharing the kind of what happened for everyone that be hearing this for the first time?
Yeah, and I'll be as brief as possible, but there's so much to this story. I mean, as you know, I've written a book called Knowing.
Yes.
Just one title, Knowing by Jeffery Olsen. It's available on Amazon, and that goes into far more detail. But I was a regular guy, happily married, 2 beautiful children, chasing my career. My wife was a school teacher. She taught high school, the upper levels. And we were on a family trip, a family vacation. It was the Easter weekend. And on the way home, I lost control of the car. And this is the difficult thing to talk about, I suppose, is there was reports of heavy crosswinds. There was reports of a truck driving erratically on the interstate. But to my best recollection, I believe I dozed off just for a minute. Just just nodded off, because what I do remember is swerving to the right, overcorrecting to the left, and the car began to roll down the interstate, not off the road, but down the road. And I had the cruise control set at 75 miles per hour, which is that's as fast as I could legally go. I blacked out for most of the accident, but when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. The first thing I heard was my 7-year-old son, my oldest son, crying in the back seat of the car. And it was a cry, as a father, I'm like, he's okay. I've got to get to my boy. I mean, he was banged up a bit, but it was a cry that made me aware that he was okay. And that's when I realized I couldn't move. I mean, I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I was struggling to breathe. I was losing consciousness. I was in intense pain. I had no idea of my injuries. I mean, I covered those briefly, but what had happened in the accident is both of my legs had been crushed. The left leg was amputated above the knee eventually. My back had been broken in L4 and L5, ironically not damaging the spinal column. My right arm had nearly been torn off. The whole rotator cuff was torn out. There was a huge laceration underneath, my armpit. And then the seatbelt had cut through my midsection and ruptured all my intestines and had just ripped my whole core wide open. And I was unaware of any of that. I just knew that my son was crying and I needed to get to my son. But that's when the brutal reality hit, and you'll realize why I couldn't speak of this for years, but that's when I knew no one else was crying. And my wife and my youngest son actually were both sleeping, which I suppose is a blessing. I mean, Tamara, my wife, had reclined her seat and she was taking a nap, and then Griffin, my youngest son, just a toddler at the time, he was only 14 months old. His it's still hard to talk about sometimes, Guy, but his car seat had broken apart, and he had been ejected from the car, which both of them were killed instantly in the accident. And I was aware of that, even though Griffin had been ejected from the car. I mean, it was the worst hell a man could be in. I mean, I thought, where's my little boy? But it's almost as if spirit just told me he's gone, which was the worst news I could have ever received. But then also I thought, well, okay, he's not suffering or hurt somewhere. But I was acutely aware of Tamara and Griffin are gone. Spencer's crying hysterically in the back seat. I can't move. I'm losing consciousness. And that's when I had the beginning of a near-death experience that has many, many elements to it. But in that darkest moment, it felt like light came. I mean, it felt like light came rushing to comfort me in this traumatic moment. And it felt as if I was rising above the scene of the accident. Oh, wow. And I kept thinking, wow, I'm okay. Now I can breathe. The pain is gone. What happened? I'm okay. And it was in that light, or that bubble of light, that suddenly Tamara, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, she was there with me, but she was emphatic that I go back. She's like, no, you can't. You've got to go back. You've got to go back. And this was all happening while you were still trapped in the car that moment.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. It's interesting. I've had Anita Mojani on the podcast talk about her experience, and also I'm not sure if you're familiar with Peter Panago. I literally
they're actually both friends of mine. I admire and respect, and we've traveled together and spoken together. Love Anita, love Peter, both of them. Very good.
Oh, well, there you go. And I just had Peter on about 8 weeks ago as well. And they all spoke about choice. Did you feel like you had a choice once you were in that moment?
I did. And in fact, I learned that choice is all there is. I mean, I think if there's one cosmic law or cosmic rule, it simply is that it's free will and choice.
And gosh, there I was looking at the woman I loved more than life, and I felt delivered from this hell, if you will. But I also knew I had a 7-year-old boy in the backseat of that car that was okay,
Wow.
and I made a choice. But in many ways, we made the choice together. That's what's so profound is we had the conversation, and I said the most profound goodbye that I'll ever say. And then the intention, our thoughts are so powerful. I didn't have to figure out how to come back. As soon as I made the choice, I'm going back. That pure intention, I actually found myself wandering about or moving about a level 1 trauma center, an emergency hospital facility. And
Wow.
that was bizarre too, because when I say wandering about, I mean, there I was. And when I say there I was, I was seeing the doctors, the patients, the nurses, the families of the patients, everything in a busy level 1 trauma unit. And I had no concept of time in this bubble of light and this profound goodbye. I later found out that people had arrived at the scene, emergency services had been called, they had to extricate me from the car. They rushed me to a local hospital, but because of the extent of my injuries, I was then life flighted to a level 1 trauma center in the closest major city. I didn't know any of that. I knew that I'd crashed the car. I said the most profound goodbye I would ever say. And here I was moving about, seeing the patients, the doctors, the nurses. But boy, Guy, I was seeing them. I mean, when I say this, this was the most profound, connected experience. I call it the oneness. I knew everything about them. I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their motivations. I knew everything about every individual I saw. And it was coupled with this pure, unconditional love. I mean, I felt connected,
Wow.
and empathy and love for every single soul or person I encountered, until I finally came up to this body, this man laying on the gurney that I didn't feel anything from, which I thought was strange. And so I stepped forward to take a closer look. And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, that's me. But that wasn't me. I was having this incredible oneness experience, but that was my body. That was the skin suit, if you will, that I knew I was going to have to put back on and get back into.
Wow. Was your body unconscious at the time when you were able to see it from that perspective? And was it like
Yes.
hours, days with the
No, no,
skin?
no. Like I say, the concept of time was probably a matter of hours. And it was an interesting experience. In fact, my level 1 trauma physician, the attending physician at that time in the facility they airlifted me or life flighted me into, we've become dear friends. He had a profound experience as I was having this strange out of body experience. And he's actually written a book about this. Both he and a nurse are willing to admit and talk about the fact that they saw my wife, Tamara, her soul. She was deceased at the scene, but her soul, her spirit was in the operating room as the team of 5 surgeons was working on me. And she communicated to the attending physician in such a powerful way that actually she just communicated her gratitude for all they were doing to save my life, because I needed to survive to raise our son. I mean, so
Holy
she was still
shit.
very connected, and he wouldn't speak of it publicly for years. They came to me in the hospital after I was feeling better and well enough, and they didn't know me from Adam. I mean, the fact that they came to share with me, and I hadn't said a word to anybody about my near-death experience, except my younger brother, who was there in the hospital with me. But they came in, and when they shared what they had experienced, wow, I thought, well, this is a safe place. And so me and the doc began to talk, and we were friends for 20 years
Oh my
before he
God.
ever mentioned it publicly. I mean, he said, hey, as a physician, I can't say I see dead people in the ER. That's professional suicide. But he finally took a sabbatical and was willing to talk about it. And he's written a beautiful book as well called Not Yet, that's also available on Amazon, where he talks about my accident, but also other things that he experienced in the ER room there.
That's mind-blowing. Did when he was in the operating table with you then, did he realize that that person was a soul and not a spirit at that point in
Yes,
time?
yes, he did. He and I have talked about it extensively. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but
It's okay.
the nurse, he got the report that they were life flighting me in, and that the accident had multiple fatalities. He said they report those things so it helps them assess the level of trauma and the speed and the level of condition of the patient, me, that may be coming in. So he was aware of that, and he wasn't actually involved in my care. He wasn't the one that had his hands in my gut trying to stop the bleeding. And it was a nurse that came and got him and said, "You've got to come down here." And if I'm relating this properly, she said, "She's down there." And he said, "Who?" And she said, "That man's wife who died at the scene is in the room." And my doctor went down there, and he said, that she seemed to be like standing in the air above my body. So he knew she was not a physical being. He knew that she was a spirit or a spiritual person, spiritual soul, but she was able to communicate with him, and she was aware that he could see her. And I mean, he might be a great guest for your show.
He sounds like
he's an incredible. He's become a dear friend, and Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll is his name, and we've become friends over the years because I could speak to him about it, and I thought, well, he's a doctor. If he had an experience, I can talk about what I experienced, and if I'm crazy, he'll put me in the psychiatric ward and get me the treatment I deserve. But we became friends because he could listen, and I was able to share in a safe place all the things that had happened to me.
I'm guessing that was his first experience too, of something.
No, he'd had others. He had had others. Which he shares in the book. He had his older brother passed away when his brother was 15 and he was only 11. And so as a child, he had this heartbreaking grief of losing his hero, his big brother, at a very young age. And he said that opened up something in him where he became aware of this other realm. And even as a physician, knowing they don't teach or talk about that in medical school, he had experiences, and he had experiences before this one. But this one was memorable and powerful enough that he and the nurse decided that they should tell me about it. And we stayed in contact after the hospital and became friends.
Wow, incredible. I didn't expect that. Did you have any other experiences whilst in hospital? Because you said you were in hospital for 6 months. Is that correct?
Almost 6 months. I was in the hospital for about 5 months, and then I was released to home health care, and then I would go back in the hospital. I would throw pulmonary emboli, the blood clots that lodge in your lungs, and I had horrible infections. So yeah, it was quite a bout. I had multiple experiences. I mean, I shared what happened at the scene of the accident. And it might be worth mentioning, the two most powerful experiences were at the scene of the accident before they life flighted me to the hospital and administered narcotics, because I was on morphine for a while in ICU just because of the extent of the injuries and the pain. And they weren't sure I was going to make it, quite honestly. But then the other most profound experience was probably at the end of my hospital stay. Now, during those months in the hospital, it felt almost like I had one foot in this realm and one in the next. Tamara, my wife, seemed very close to me. I mean, I would feel her, and there was times I felt as if I stepped outside of the body again, and she was right there crazy things maybe, but even early on, she was communicating with me what she wanted done at her services, what she wanted sung, almost trivial things like, I want that special ring given to my cousin, or I want my party dresses, give those to my sister-in-laws, and yet very profound things. She wanted to be buried with Griffin, the baby, in her arms. And she communicated all this to me in the hospital. But at the end of my hospital stay, When I was off of the narcotics, I was out of ICU, I was out of surgical recovery. I was actually in the rehabilitation wing. Another near-death experience. I don't know what to call it, a vision, a transformation. What had happened is I was finally able to sleep on my side. And I had laid on my back so long in the hospital, I'd rubbed the back of my head bald. All the hair had been rubbed off the back of my head from laying on my back, but they had finally stabilized all those abdominal injuries. And so I was finally able to lay on my side.
Wow.
And I recall drifting off into a very deep, comfortable, peaceful sleep. Because I had been unconscious and I had slept in the hospital, but I was aware of, wow, I'm peacefully sleeping. And then I felt that light again, that same light that came at the scene of the accident, that seemed to surround me. And it seemed to lift me above the hospital bed again. But this time the light kind of went away. It kind of dispersed like fog off a lake or something. It just seemed to kind of go away. And I was in the most incredible place. I mean, it was so beautiful. And I've heard people say heaven or the other side, or the spirit world. The only word I can come up with that comes close is that I was home. I was home. It felt so familiar, so loving, so open. In fact, I began to run. With my legs crushed and one amputated. I wasn't going to run in this life. But there I was running, and it felt like a very physical experience, and I was elated. And then I kind of had the knowing that I wasn't there to stay. And at that same time, there was this corridor off to my left. And I knew intuitively I'm to go down that corridor. So I began to make my way down the corridor. And at the end of the corridor was a crib. Now, Griffin, my toddler boy, was sleeping in a crib at the time of the accident. I mean, he was of that age. And so I raced to this crib, and I looked in, and there he was. And he was beautiful. He was not hurt. He was not injured. He was absolutely perfect. And I had been haunted by this since the scene of the accident, wondering, about him being ejected from the car. Anyway, I swept him up and I held him in my arms. Guy, I don't know if you have children. Have you ever picked up a sleeping child?
I got a 4.5 month-old daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can imagine. I swept up my boy, and the weight and the heat when you pick up, and I could feel him breathing. I mean, I'm like, he's okay. And in fact, I held him close, and I felt his breath on my neck. I knew he was breathing. And it's odd that it was such a physical experience, but I felt him breathing. And I leaned over and I smelled his hair. I thought, it's him. I mean, it's like, this is my child. And I began to weep, holding my little boy. Number one, that he was okay. Number two, that we were together in a very, very, what felt like a very physical way. And yet, as I held him and began to weep, I felt a very powerful presence coming up behind me. I mean, it was something this just so powerful, so overwhelming, so cosmic. And I actually began to be fearful, because I'd grown up in a very conservative Christian home, and I thought, that's God coming. And the guilt began to bubble up. I had extreme guilt because I was driving the car. Here I was holding my child. And I thought, he died because I lost control of the car. His life was cut short, because I overcorrected and the car rolled. And I had all this guilt coming up as this presence was coming closer and closer. And as it became right up to me, I had the thought, I hope somehow I can be forgiven. And yet what happened in that moment, here I was holding my child, and I felt, and this almost felt physical too, I felt these divine arms wrap around and hold both of us. and then it's like the lid just came off. I mean, there was this downpouring. And the first thing as I held my child and then was held was there's nothing to forgive. Everything is in perfect divine order. And you are as precious to us as the child you hold, except even magnified. And yet it was a very personal experience, but I knew it encompassed all of us, all of humanity, everyone, you know. But there was this downpouring of peace and love and knowing. And I did have an extensive, or at least a powerful life review. I was seeing my life and I was saying,
Wow.
oh, no, that was a mistake, you know, that was a mistake. And this beautiful being communicated to me, those are your judgments of it, not ours. We love you. You're perfect to you're as perfect to us as that child you hold. That was the beautiful thing, is everything I felt from my son, I was feeling that magnified back from this divine being. And you know, Griffin was just learning to walk. He was just learning to say a few words, and you know, they crawl and fall and drool, and you'll have all those beautiful things coming up, my friend. But he was perfect to me, and yet in those arms, the divine was communicating that you're all perfect to us. You're simply learning to walk, and we love you. And there aren't words really, Guy, to describe it. But again, choice came up, and then I'll wrap up so we can chat. But I was given a choice. I was told I could be angry at God for the rest of my life because half my family passed. I was told I could feel guilty for the rest of my life because I was driving the car. But I was given a different choice that I hadn't thought of. And I was told that I could exercise my will. That in that beautiful, profound moment, I could give my son, I could let him go, I could pass him over, I could hand it off and exercise my will in the situation, even though, yes, the accident had happened, yes, he had already passed away, but I was given the opportunity to give him back to God. And in all that love, I kissed my little boy and I handed him back. And then I came back to myself in the hospital bed, to the injuries, the amputation, the wheelchair, all those things. But yeah, it shifted my perceptions a bit, to say the least.
I can only imagine. You know, I'm just thinking of everyone listening to this now. You know, those experiences are so unique and individual and personal, like you said. But like, how real did it feel when it was happening? Like, did it feel like you're in another reality like this, or did it feel dreamlike, or like how?
You know, I'm so glad you asked. I mean, I call it a dream in the book because I don't know what to say, but I'll tell you what, that was far more real than this is.
There you go.
This
Wow.
is the weird, crazy, foggy dream now. That was pure reality. And when I talked about how physical it felt, you know, the joy of me running and thinking I'm home, like I could feel the energy of the ground under my feet. I could feel intelligence in my calves and thighs. And when I picked up my little boy, I just felt everything, light and love in every one of his cells. I mean, it was like, it was so physical. It was beyond physical. It was like the senses were multiplied. So it was like sensual. Like I could smell his hair. I could feel him. It was beyond anything I've experienced here, and magnified, but far more real. This feels like the dense dream to me after experiencing that.
Wow, incredible. I hear what you say, because I think I've spoken about it briefly before, but I had a meditational experience, and I went beyond myself and expanded to something greater, that I felt connected and is almost like a knowing and clarity came through that I couldn't perceive just through my five senses in this reality. And it was like a glimpse, a gift, if you like. And once I had that experience, like a lot went on, but that was the kind of gist of it. And I could bring that back into my body. And from that moment on, it just changed the game and direction, because all of a sudden I could bring that into my perception. It brought more awareness to how I was actually perceiving reality, and realizing that I'm just perceiving reality through the lens in which I've decided to look upon life, from my own belief systems and upbringing and everything that's putting a bias to it. And it helped me get beyond that bias, if you like, and
Wow.
and start to see things, or try to see things for how they really are, not how I interpret them to be. you
Wow.
know, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah. I mean, our perceptions are a reality, but when that breaks open, yeah, everything in this experience was somewhat turned upside down and inside out for me, but in a beautiful, expansive way. Now, I still grieved. I mean, I don't want anyone to think I had the accident and had these profound experiences and I was okay. I mean, the accident happened. I had beautiful, profound experiences, but I grieved horribly, you know, and missed them and cried and had to fight to get back healthy. Now, my son who survived, Spencer, he was my motivating force. I mean, he was the reason I came back, and he was the reason I was committed to getting well and learning to walk again and getting back to work. And he's one of the heroes of my story. I mean, I eventually did fall in love again and remarried. And Tanya, my current wife, is the other hero of my story. Though those two are the heroes, and then we adopted two boys. I
wow.
don't call them my adopted boys. They're just all my sons. They just came to me in different ways, but those are the heroes of the story. I mean, though, you know, I don't know what I would not I don't know what I would have done without all that support and all those things happening. Um,
It's incredible. It's like you lived 1,000 lifetimes in this one chapter of a book, kind of thing, and to go through all that, I still can't relate. I was only thinking this morning, well, I actually took Ava for a walk, my daughter, and I just, she's my world now, and I can't even go there to what you experienced, right? Um, there's two questions that came to me. Did you share your experiences? Actually, let me just start with that one first, and I'll try and remember the second question. But when you had those experiences, did you share them with people straight away, or did you find yourself trying to compute everything that was happening and thought you're going crazy, or like,
Yeah,
where
I
were you
didn't
at?
share much. I only told my younger brother and my mother about these experiences. Now, interesting enough, when I had the experience with my son Griffin, when I fell into the deep sleep, my younger brother was there in the hospital with me. I mean, my brothers were incredible. I'm the middle of older and younger brother, and they both about lost their jobs to see to me. And even though I was months into my hospital stay, my younger brother was there, and he knew how difficult it was for me to sleep. I was still grieving miserably, and I was still in intense pain, and mostly, I mean, the physical pain was bad enough, but the emotional pain. And he had said that night, he said, "I'll just sit with you till you fall asleep." And I did fall asleep. And yet when I came back to myself after this experience, this visitation, this vision, if you will, he was still there. And he had dozed off in the chair by my hospital bed. And I woke him. And I did tell him right in that moment, I said, "I've had the most incredible experience." And I was emotional and weeping. And I told him I was with Griffin. I was with God. I didn't even know how to put it in words, but he remembers it well. And I'm very, very close to my brothers. I was comfortable enough telling him that.
Mm.
But yeah, he was right there. Now, as far as the general public or anybody else, I didn't say much to anyone for years. I didn't want people to think I was crazy. I had a lot of processing to do myself, just processing everything that had happened. And then it was painful. I couldn't speak of it without I would just burst into tears, which made me feel silly. And so I just avoided the conversation.
Wow. Yeah. With the second question I was going to ask in that recovery, because again, I'm thinking of people that might be listening to this that might be in
Right.
pain right now of whatever circumstances in their life, were there any key moments during your recovery or pivotal points that you can now reflect back upon and think, wow, I'm really glad I did that, or hung on to that, or to help
Oh,
your
wow.
to help your
Yeah,
process?
yeah. Yeah, there's so many. In fact, one of the first ones was interesting because it was when I was returning home from the hospital. And of course, my brothers had come to get me. And at that point, my right leg was in a brace because they had to rebuild the whole knee. My left leg obviously was amputated above the knee. My right arm was in a sling because they were attempting to repair all the rotator cuff and shoulder. All I could do was drive an electric wheelchair with my one left hand and arm that worked. But my brothers came to get me, and I wasn't able to go to my own home. I was going to my younger brother's home, and he had been taking care of Spencer, my oldest son, during this long hospital stay. But as we arrived home, I became so worried about Spencer. I'd been thinking about him, and he'd come and see me in the hospital. But I thought, how's he going to accept me as a father? I mean, I was the rough and tumble dad, and now I was in a wheelchair with one working arm. How was he going to process all this? And as we drove up to the house, there he was peeking out the window, watching as my brothers, his uncles, lifted me. His dad literally had to lift me up and put me in the wheelchair. And I thought, how's he going to deal with this? And everything was so atrophied. I mean, I was still very sick and quite weak. And as they put me in the wheelchair, he came running out of the house and he began to run toward me, but he ran right past me. He just went right past. And I thought, oh, I knew this was going to be hard. I mean, now we're on his turf. I'm not in the hospital. We're going to have to go to the grocery store like this, And it was emotional and difficult. And I began to navigate my way up to the house, and my brothers had built a ramp so I could drive the wheelchair up. And as I turned the wheelchair, I just looked to see where he had gone. And he had run across the street, and he was knocking on all the neighbors' doors, and he was shouting, "Come out, come out. My dad has made it home. Come see my dad." And I burst into tears
Wow.
again. And he, and he eventually did come, and he threw himself on my lap, which just about killed me because I still had all the, the sutures and everything from my surgery. And he threw his arms around me, and I explained to him, hey, I'm going to be like this for a while, but I'm going to work very hard to get well and function. And I said, are you going to be okay with this? And we still laugh about this. He's a grown man now, but he said, Dad, if you were nothing but a puddle of blood, I would still love you. And through the tears, we began laughing, and he hugged me tight. And here's why I share this. It was in that moment that I had a profound realization. I thought, wow, here I am in a wheelchair holding my surviving son in this realm. And it is no less divine than being in those other realms holding my son that's passed. I mean, suddenly, like heaven was right here. And there was nowhere to go. There was nothing to become. It was like, wow, right in this profound now moment. And I've had several of those, and many of those as this has unfolded. There's been those horrible, grieving, painful moments, and there's been those glimpses of, wow, maybe heaven's right here. Maybe it's not about, oh, eventually when I pass, or maybe I can embrace this beautiful, beautiful gift that life is, and find heaven right in the moment of a sunset when I'm just sitting there, with my child, my spouse, by myself, but literally connecting to that divine part of me that knows it's all okay, and
Wow.
that each moment is a profound gift in some cosmic way.
It's being able to see it, isn't it? Far out. With it, from your out of body experiences and the experiences you had, were there anything that happened, or lessons or insights that came to you for, like, why me? Why this accident? Why now? Why in this time?
Mm. Yeah, you ask such great questions, Scott. You really do. I mean, I asked the why questions a lot. Why? And it wasn't until I shifted that to the what. What am I learning? What is my soul's journey? And what is the opportunity provided in this catastrophe, if you will? I had a profound thing. This was later on. This was after, I mean, gosh, I had healed. I was walking on a prosthetic. And in fact, I had met Tanya, my current wife. And, she was just a friend at first, but I realized that I was having romantic feelings for her. I was incredibly lonely as a man, but I found myself back on Tamara's grave, my wife who had passed, and I was angry. I was kind of like even crying out to her, saying, how dare you leave me like this? I mean, I'm limping. I'm trying to raise our son, and you're in that beautiful place. How dare you go? And boy, that veil, if you will, got so thin. I felt her there with me. Suddenly, it's like,
Wow.
wow, she was there, and it's almost as if I could feel her hands on my shoulders as I'm hunched over, bawling in her grave. And she communicated, and she said, "Don't berate me. I loved you enough to leave." And I'm like, "You loved me enough to leave? What do you mean by?" And she said, "We had a deal. There was a contract. I would have loved nothing more than to stay and grow old with you, but we had a different plan. Your soul is expanding. You're learning things you would have learned no other way. And I loved you enough to leave and support that. Please do not berate me." And this was one of the insights. I don't fight fair. And I said, "Well, by the way, I'm having feelings for another woman." I mean, it was like an argument here between spirit and me. And she laughed. She laughed and said, "Of course you are. I know who you are. I'm watching this all. In fact, I'm trying to orchestrate it." She said, "Please," and here's choice again. The words she used were, "Choose joy. Please choose joy." Because she said, "You're holding me hostage in your grief. I'm still connected. I'm watching it. I hurt with you. Even though I might have a higher perspective, I can only be as happy as you are. I want you to be happy. I want you to move forward. I've never gotten over it. I've gotten used to it. You don't get past it. You move along with it. But here was the pleading of the woman that I, was married to and who I loved, saying, "I want you to be happy. Love again. Move on in life. Choose joy." And I'd heard those words whispered to me from what felt like the divine previous to that. So it's almost like she was repeating it to me. But that was an insight that, wow, it's a choice. We can't control what happens, but we can control to some extent how we experience it by looking not at what we've lost, but what we have, and what we can gain and what we can learn from the situation.
Wow. You know, there's a paradoxical question that came into me there, and I'm forgive me if I'm not on the right track or not, but
Well, it's okay.
the thing that come to mind is like a soul contract. If this is kind of pre-written our destiny, because it's often spoke about in these kind of conversations. But then when we come here, we have free will and choice, which is the paradox. What are your views on all of this then?
It's a huge paradox. It's a dichotomy. It is the duality we live in. In other words, she communicated, we had a soul contract. There was destiny in this thing. But at the same time, I had free will and choice. I could choose to be the guy strung out on some street corner somewhere wondering what happened. That
Totally.
was a choice. And quite honestly, that would have been honored by the universe too. I still would have been loved, and maybe just as much and even more so. So I feel that in that dichotomy, we do have a soul's journey. We do have a end goal, so to speak, and things are going to happen. But there's free will and choice all along the way, and yet that paradox, that end goal, that final journey to me is to pure unconditional love in the end. And whether I'm a struggling homeless addict or whether I remarry and adopt children, that's just the journey. But the end result will be finally grasping pure unconditional love, and quite honestly, for myself. That was the most powerful. I know Anita speaks of this too, but I was looking for outside validation in everything. Oh gosh, just let me feel better. I mean, just help me, and I'm using these, I was looking for this validation. There was this big sucking hole in me that could not be filled, even with what I experienced. I mean, here I was held in the arms of God, which was very validating, but that was still an external force giving me the, hey, you're okay, you're beautiful, you're perfect to us.
Mm.
It wasn't until I stepped into self-love, to forgiving myself and loving myself and realizing that those moments are gifts, and then capitalizing on them in a way that expands my soul rather than diminishing it, that I found forgiveness and joy and peace. And it took some time. In fact, gosh, Tanya would tell you, I was a mess even after she married me. I was still picking up the pieces and putting things together. And Spencer, my surviving son, was one of the catalysts in bringing me along that path to self-love and self-forgiveness, which was finally the healing that brought me peace in any way.
Wow, that's incredible. What trying to articulate this last question for you in the right way. My brain's gone. I'm more caught up in what you were saying then. When people are struggling, feeling this way, or that's what I was going to say as well. Do you think then to put meaning into life is to find our own divinity within us, so then we can share it with others?
Wow, that's pretty profound, Guy. And yes, I believe we're only here to learn, and the only thing we're here to learn is to remember, to put back together, or to realize our own divinity. I love how you asked the question, because if I realize that I'm divine, that if I am that I am,
Mm.
then I can be my perfect vibration in this whole big game. In other words, this universe, this one verse, this one song, this universe. I can sing my pitch, I can sing my tone, and it'll be unique from anyone else. And if I realize that that's divine and that that's perfect just the way I am, and follow that and honor that and trust that, then yeah, I believe that's what we're here for, is to remember that. Now, there's nothing to become in that. It's simply to be that, but realizing it and recognizing it. I mean, others have done this. We all talk about this fellow, my dear friend that wandered this earth 2,000 years ago, saying, hey, I'm a divine manifestation of that. And people don't like that and are often uncomfortable with it. But if we realize that, and if we embraced that type of love, we'd solve all the world's problems. We wouldn't be at war or have poverty. We would literally lock arms and stand up together in oneness and say, let's just have each other's back and make this world a beautiful place. And heaven might be right here if we did. There may be nowhere to go. We would just create it right here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I just want to wrap up on a couple of things before you finish. I want to talk about books. I got two questions for you. One is about your own books. How many have you released now, written and released?
I've written 3 books,
Three.
and I've been contributors to several others. One came out of the UK, but my first book was I Knew Their Hearts, and that I never had any intention of writing a book. I never had any intention of speaking about this. In fact, it's funny. I was approached by a publisher to write the first book, which I did, and I figured my mother would buy a copy. It all seemed quite futile to me, but boy, the book hit number 3 on Amazon in the category in the first 10 days, and suddenly there was all these requests to talk about it, and that was incredible. And so then the publisher asked me to follow it up. The first book was about the near-death experience. The second one was about putting together all the pieces. How do you build a life or rebuild a life after having it all shattered. And that book did quite well, as it did well too. But the third book, knowing is the definitive one. It's actually the first two books compiled together with deeper insights and extended chapters, and it continues on in life right up right through Spencer, my oldest son, the who survived the accident with me, right up through his marriage. He was recently married and has grown into this incredible man. And it's his journey too, because he didn't have any near-death experience. He had lost everything I lost, but he had no answers, no visions, no dreams, none of that. And so anyway, knowing is, if you want to know the story, knowing is the book to get.
Is the book to get.
That actually encompasses the first two. Yes.
Yeah, amazing. Just to wrap up the show, with everything that we've covered today, is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners to ponder on?
Oh, wow. Yes. I mean, I'm here in the United States where we're so divided right now. We're just weeks, well, we're practically days from an election. And here in this part of the world that I'm at, everything's divided by gender, by race, by religion, by preference, by political party. This is an illusion. Here's what to ponder. We are one. There is more oneness in humanity. We have far more in common as God's children, if you will, than we will ever have separate. And if we could simply change every thought of us and them into we, into this oneness, into this unity, into we, the people together worldwide, could literally shift consciousness in such a powerful way. It would be like the pandemic, this corona in 72 hours, suddenly it was everywhere, everything. It was a global pandemic. What if we created a pandemic of love, a pandemic of caring, a pandemic of compassion? That's what I'm about. And that's what to ponder. How in the world can I, as one person, shift consciousness or do something about all that's going on? And in the end, perhaps it's quite simple. I can be a better person. I can be a kinder person. I can treat others with respect, even if they're completely different from me. And I can love those that are different from me and be educated about why they're different, and just be open.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a great place to end this podcast, Jeffrey. If anyone, are you active on social media at all? Do you have a website or a newsletter?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm active. I post a lot of pictures. I love nature, but you can find me under my full name. It's Jeffery, Jeffery, middle initial C, Olsen, Olsen. And that's my Gmail address too, jeffreycolson@gmail.com. You can find me there and write me a note. Or my website is Envoy Publishing. Envoy is French for messenger, envoypublishing.com, and you can find videos and ways to contact me there as well.
Beautiful. Everything will be linked in the show notes below. And Jeffrey, I just want to thank you for coming on the show and just speaking so open-heartedly and sharing your wisdom, your journey, and everything that you've learned along the way. And I just know it's had an impact on my life, and I'm just very grateful for everything that you've done. So thank you.
You're an incredible man. You're very welcome, and I'm honored to be on your show. Have a beautiful, beautiful day, and take care of Australia for me, and we'll both send love to Wales.
Absolutely. I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Cheers.